everyone. My name is Nona Jones, and I am the founder of Faith and Prejudice. Thank you so much for taking a moment to join us for this special broadcast. Listen, over this last almost year, we have hosted some very consequential conversations about various aspects of the history of racism in America, both how it has manifested in the past as well as how it is showing up in the present. I'm really excited about today's conversation because we're taking a slight pivot to talk about the global context of inequity. And we're going to have a conversation with a couple of people that I deeply respect, I deeply admire, because they are not just researchers, they are not just people who think about these issues, they are practitioners and they are doing the work. So today we're going to take some time to learn a bit more about the global hunger crisis, as well as how it is showing up domestically here in the United States of America. So I want to just quickly introduce you to our very distinguished guests. First and foremost, I'm very excited to have with us Dr. Jenny Dyer. She is the founder of the 2030 Collaborative, and she directs the Faith-Based Coalition for Global Nutrition, and then she has support from various foundations, but she also directs the Faith-Based Coalition for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. She teaches global health politics and policy, and she is also a lecturer in the Department of Health Policy at Vanderbilt School of Medicine. She is very distinguished, and her work sits at the intersection of faith and global health. I'm also very excited to be joined by Jeremy Everett. Jeremy is the founder. He is also the executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Just to describe this collaborative a bit to you, it integrates both research and practice through various projects, including the Texas Hunger Initiative, the Research Fellows Program, the Global Hunger and Migration Project, as well as the Hunger Data Lab, among others. He has been such a staunch advocate for addressing food insecurity in the United States of America and how it is showing up in communities of color. And I think that tonight's conversation is going to not only give you a broader understanding of the context of hunger in the world, but I believe it's also going to give you some of the practical steps that you can take as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, to feed those who are hungry right in your backyard. And so before we get started, first of all, Jenny and Jeremy, I'm so grateful to have you. I always like to ask our guests to introduce yourselves beyond the credentials, beyond the degrees, beyond the accolades. Just tell us a little bit about you, where you grew up, and what got you on the path to becoming a global health advocate and activist. I'd actually like to start with you, Jenny, and then I'd love to hear from you as well, Jeremy.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Nona, for this opportunity. We're just thrilled to be here today with you guys at Faith and Prejudice. This is really an exciting opportunity to share these issues. So I was, I'm from Middle Tennessee. I'm from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And my grandfather was a preacher. And so I was just raised in the church. My grandfather was Church of Christ. So, we were very evangelical, grew up going to church, 5 times a week, knew the Bible backwards and forwards by the time I was like 10, and loved the church, loved thinking about religion, loved studying scripture. I was just that kind of kid. And even in high school, knew that I wanted to study religion in college. All the while, I was also the kid that was like helping with the soup kitchens and, doing all the kind of VBS stuff and the volunteer work. So all of this I knew was going to be part probably of a career choice. And then went to Samford University and Jeremy was there, and majored in religion. I was one of the few girls at the time. It was the late 90s. And the Southern Baptist Convention was going through a fundamentalist time where girls weren't really encouraged to be leaders in religion. But this department of professors really was encouraging. And so I just say all that to say, I always had this curiosity to ask the questions around religion. Why do people believe what they believe? Why are we doing what we do? Why do some churches believe in the elect and some believe once saved, always saved? Why, all these kinds of questions, and went on to continue that work in graduate school. Thought I wanted to be a New Testament scholar, but kind of pivoted into the social science of religion. And all the while wound up continued doing activism, even with Jeremy at Samford. We were doing clothing drives and, firehouse room at the end kind of stuff, and leading that. And then during my graduate work, I ran into a guy who was leading efforts worldwide around the AIDS issue. Right around 2000, and nobody really was talking about AIDS in Africa in 2000. AIDS was this highly stigmatized issue, if you remember from the culture wars of the 80s and 90s. So evangelicals wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole back then. I mean, even you would sit down with pastors for lunch and say, "We got a pandemic. What are you going to do?" And they would say, "I'm out. I don't want to get involved with this." So it took a lot of work, but started working with Bono in about 2001, 2002, rallying faith leaders across the nation through awareness raising and education on the issue of HIV/AIDS, the reality of it in the lives of people in developing nations. And we're able to move the Bush administration to do some historic work, which became the legislation of PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So that really was a way to move into a career where I could do both. I could work with faith leaders and take all that I had garnered from my religious education and put it towards helping the poor, loving our neighbor, even if they were a continent away. And so that's kind of a soup to nuts, but I love what I do, and I've loved what I've done for the last 20 years, and I wouldn't trade it.
Jeremy, tell us your story also.
Yeah, well, I want to echo Dr. Dyer's sentiments and thank you, Nona, for the invitation to be a part of this program. We love what you're doing, and I'm grateful that you're having such success doing it. You're dealing with a bunch of important issues that need to be dealt with on the forefront of both from faith leaders' perspectives, but also informing faith leaders and elected officials and the business community and so forth. So grateful to be here. In many respects, there are aspects to Jenny's story that parallel mine. Only the difference would be my father was a pastor, and we joked that he only had 3 years worth of sermons. And so we moved a lot. I was born in San Antonio and lived in a few Texas cities, but graduated high school in Florida, and then met Jenny at Samford in Birmingham. And I did everything to earn that typical preacher's kid status. I was always in trouble, and so I was either playing basketball or finding my way to get in trouble for most of my childhood and all the way up into college. So grateful to Jenny and several of our other friends for making sure that I graduated. In fact, I remember when I was in college, my dad would never, he didn't call. My mom would call throughout, my 4 years there, but my dad would call every week at the end of my senior semester, my second semester in my senior year, just saying, "Are you sure you're going to graduate? Are you sure you're going to graduate?" And so I was that student for sure. But, I think what happened for me is when you move a lot, you're on the outside. And when you're on the outside of a social system, you see all the other outsiders. And they're all there. And so you see the people that are on the margins. Sometimes it's because of race. Sometimes it's because of poverty status. Sometimes it's because they don't look like everybody else does. Maybe it's because they speak a different language. But you see the people that are on the outside. And I didn't know what to do with that until when I got to college. I started thinking about the types of groups of people that I grew up around. In the worlds that I operated from. It wouldn't be uncommon for me when I was in high school to play basketball at one of the local housing projects with all of my friends who played on the basketball team, and then to go to maybe a church member's house that lived on a golf course at a country club. And those are just kind of the two worlds that I lived between my whole childhood. And when I got to college, I began to ask our religious leaders and pastors in the community, like, about inequity. I just said I feel very uncomfortable about the existence of inequity in our society, and wanted some guidance. And some gave good advice, and others probably said, you should just be grateful for what you have. But for me, I found truth the summer after our junior year in college. I came across the story of St. Francis of Assisi. And here I was, a third generation Baptist preacher's kid at a Baptist college, studying religion, assuming I was going to be a Baptist minister like everybody else in my family, and had never heard of the story of St. Francis. And when I heard the story of St. Francis and the fact that he gave away all his possessions and then chose to live a life intertwined with people in poverty, that to me was my answer. I knew at that moment what I was called to do. So I got all my stuff together in my little Birmingham, my little apartment on campus, and I loaded it up in my car, and I drove over the mountain to downtown Birmingham, Kelly Ingram Park, which we all know is very famous for all the civil rights activity. It's where a lot of homeless used to hang out when Jenny and I were in college. And I gave away all my possessions, and at that point, I knew I was called to address the issues of hunger and poverty. Now, I didn't know what that meant. I had never heard of nonprofit work. I didn't know anything, but I knew at that point that I needed to move into low-income communities so I could see what was happening in impoverished America from the inside out. So that's really what set me on the path.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful, and I think it's also a testament to the fact that God wastes nothing. I think about you saying that you were getting in trouble a lot, but that may have been the case, but God still had a plan and a purpose for your life. And I think that we all need to know that, our past does not disqualify us from future impact. I think on this issue of hunger, when most Americans think of hunger, there's just this idea of, oh yeah, that's what I feel, when it's getting close to lunchtime or it's getting close to dinner time. But I would really like you to help us understand, what hunger actually is beyond this very limited kind of Western understanding, as well as, why does it matter to the overall health and well-being of an individual and a community? And I'd love to start with you, Jenny, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, Jeremy.
Yeah, and Jeremy and I come at this from different places. I'm sure Jeremy will tell you. I mean, he wrote this wonderful book called I Was Hungry, and it really focused more a little bit on the domestic issues of hunger, which are a little different yet intersect at the same time with a Venn diagram with international hunger issues. I've mostly worked in the international hunger space. So thinking about your question this morning, there's different kinds of hunger, and we're not talking about like missing lunch. We're talking about deep hunger, having missed food for maybe days or a meal for many days in a row. A hunger that depletes your muscles, a hunger that brings down your immune system. So there are a couple of different kinds of hunger I wanted to bring up, or there's an acute hunger, acute malnutrition, and then there's chronic malnutrition. So right now what's going on is there's a lot of acute malnutrition, and that has been exacerbated mostly because of COVID-19. There's supply problems, distribution problems, and then food prices have gone up. So around the world, for instance, the World Food Program usually in an average year feeds about 100 million people. They're the largest distributor of food resources. Last year, they distributed food to 140 million, and this year they predict 150 million. So you're talking about 40 to 50% increase in acute malnutrition and hunger issues around the world, particularly in developing nations. This is mostly happening in nations with conflict states. Famine is not, famine is man-made. It's not from God. So, it's usually the result of conflict. Climate plays a role, climate crises, the droughts, the locusts have been a massive problem this year for some countries in Eastern Africa. And then, of course, the COVID crisis. So kind of the 3 Cs have really impacted it. And when I say that, I mean, to the point of starvation. There are millions right now millions of families living on the brink of starvation right now. So this is a crisis like we haven't seen in many years. Since 1990, the world has been able to work together to decrease the deaths from hunger by 50%. So in our generation, we've been able to do some tremendous things in global health and global development, cutting number of people dying from AIDS in half, TB, malaria, but also hunger. However, it's kind of been a J curve the last 3 years because of climate change issues, because of increase of conflict, and now COVID has just exacerbated all of that. So the time is nigh. It's an emergency. It's time to talk about it. We need to talk about it. They're our brothers and sisters, and we need to be on the front lines as a nation to lead in ending hunger. We know how to do it. We need the political will to do it. The chronic malnutrition is more of the lifelong nutrition. Just as a snapshot of that, chronic malnutrition can really change the entire life of a human. When we talk about chronic malnutrition, we often talk about the importance of the first 1,000 days in a person's life, from conception to the age 2. And in that very important, fragile window, when the mom is carrying the child and then nursing the child and then feeding the child, if the child does not have adequate nutrition and mom doesn't have adequate nutrition, literally you can do PET scans on the children's brains, and the child of a healthy child that has been fully nourished has a different PET scan than a child who is hungry, and that is irreversible. So the child who is stunted, we call it cognitive stunting, and then becomes physically stunted, and you may have seen this, will be for their lifespan because of the lack of nutrition during that first 1,000 days. And 1 out of 4 kids around the world experience stunting. So this is a huge epidemic, if you will. So we're really in a moment of crisis between both acute malnutrition and chronic malnutrition. And we would argue that there's not many things that are more important than feeding the poor. Of course, Jesus calls us to do this. It's the command of Matthew 25. From Genesis to Revelation, it is an echo of feeding the orphan and the widow and the alien and serving the poor. But this is a real moment. I think we can all come together and address these very important issues, both here at home and around the world.
As you were talking, I just felt this just sense of helplessness when you think about starvation. And it's striking to me that these statistics are as worse as they are in what many people would consider to be such an economically rich world. And so it's just striking. I'd love, Jeremy, if you can add your perspective on this idea of hunger from a domestic lens.
Yeah, well, I think to build upon what Jenny said, you can typically judge the health and well-being of a society or a country based upon the prevalence and the severity of hunger. So you can kind of consider it a banner. So like in the US, for example, we were at relatively historic lows for food insecurity in the US, and before the pandemic, we were at 11.1%, and we had finally made some gains that after the Great Recession, and so it took us 7 years to see food insecurity in the U.S., which is the technical term that we use, which means somebody doesn't have enough food to live an active, healthy lifestyle. But it took us 7 years to see food insecurity or hunger reduced to pre-recession levels. So finally we get it down to 11.1%, and then the pandemic hits, and now it skyrockets to over 23%, which is the highest rates that we've had on record in modern American history. And so we know that if it took us 7 years to see food insecurity drop below those rates pre-recession, and with supply chain disruption and economic instability that we've seen throughout this pandemic, we know it could take us another decade to see those numbers begin to decrease. And so, but when you think about it, what does hunger look like here in the U.S.? Well, it typically means that people people experience this at the end of a pay period. They simply don't make enough money to make ends meet. And so if you're in a minimum wage paying job in the US right now, and you're able to get 40 hours a week, 52 weeks out of the year, which is almost unheard of, you would only make $15,000 a year. And even in a place like Waco, Texas, where I live, where the cost of living isn't that high, you can barely pay rent, much less pay for your food expenses, your childcare expenses, your medical expenses, or anything else. And so families in the US are forced to decide what are they going to pay for in a given pay period. So they have to make trade-offs. They have to decide, are they going to pay for food or rent or transportation costs? If they don't pay rent, they get kicked out of their home. If they don't pay the light bill, the power gets shut off. And so oftentimes they make food that trade-off. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, they're having to do that in more extreme circumstances.
I want to build on that, because I feel like in the US, we tend to be defined more by obesity than food scarcity, right? Like that tends to be the way people think of us. Like, of course you have plenty of food, but when it comes to issues of hunger in the US, Jeremy, I would love to hear your thoughts on just, what should people know? And then how do we address it? As Christians who see these issues, or sometimes don't even see them. One of the things that I thought about as the pandemic was spinning up is all of these children who got their one meal at school, and now, schools are closed. And so it's like, wow, what happens there? But a lot of times we don't think about that because that's not our context. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what else we need to know, and then how we can address the issue.
Yeah. I think the first thing to know is, and what I would encourage people to do, is to get proximity to the problem. Brian Stevenson says you can't solve a social problem from a distance. You have to be immersed in that reality. Congressman John Lewis used to talk about when he met with a group of our students, and he said, what was important when he was an organizer with SNCC, or the Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is that they lived and dwelled among the people where they were working and organizing. And so they called it incarnational organizing. He's like, if Jesus can live and dwell among us, then we should do the same thing for the people that we're serving. And so for 20 years, that was I lived and worked in low-income neighborhoods, and I remember one neighbor that left an indelible mark on me, and really became emblematic for what we see with food insecurity and with poverty in the U.S. The woman was Lupe, was her name. She lived 2 doors down from us when we lived on the west side of San Antonio. And Lupe and her husband were devout Catholics. They had 8 children. And she also was the primary caregiver to her 2 wheelchair-bound parents. Now, in the neighborhood where we lived, the median income was $19,000 per household, and the norm was that you had 3 generations sharing a home. So not a lot of money being shared among a lot of people. Our other neighbor had over 20 people living in a small 2-bedroom home, and so resources were limited. Now, Lupe's husband, Luis, had the only full-time job with one employer of anybody on our block. Everybody else was trying to piece together as many jobs as they could to be able to try to pay for all the bills that they incurred. And so they had one little car, and Luis would take that car to work every day. And then Lupe would send her kids off to school, get her parents situated at a local senior center, and then she would make her way down to the elementary school, and then the middle school, and then the high school to volunteer in the schools, because she knew the ticket out of poverty for her kids was education, and for the other kids in our neighborhood. Now, our best high school had a 50% dropout rate in the community. Well, Lupe, while we lived there, got an ear infection, and it was she didn't have health insurance because nobody did in our community. And she waited until that ear infection was too painful to bear. And she ended up catching a bus. She went down to one of the local emergency rooms where she waited in the emergency room waiting room all day, waiting to be seen. But she never was called back. And so eventually she knew she needed to catch the bus to get back home because her kids were going to be getting out of school. Well, later that evening, after she got home, her eardrum ruptured. The infection went into her brain. She fell into a coma and she never woke up. And the next day, her kids and her husband were going door to door in our neighborhood trying to raise money for a memorial service so that they could bury their mother. And Luis came and he sat on my front porch and he just put his head in his hands and he just wept. And he just said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" The reality is we oftentimes think about hunger different from poverty or different from healthcare access or different from, good paying jobs. But it's the same family, like Lupe's, bearing the weight of all of our broken social systems. They are disproportionately people of color, 3 times as likely to be people of color in the US as Anglo households. They're oftentimes families that have been underemployed, which is the primary cause of hunger in the US, is underemployment, meaning that people are working, they just aren't making enough money to be able to make ends meet. And so, they're experiencing all of that. And so families like Lupe's, were frequently food insecure, not having access to enough food to get them to the end of the week. In the summer months were very difficult for them when all those kids couldn't get that school meal and they were at home, because it's not like Luis got a pay raise during the summer months. So you're right. You're right. We see a lot of families who are experiencing that, and it's only gotten worse during the pandemic. With child hunger specifically, kids have had to resort to we created a program for kids in rural communities because once the pandemic hit, children didn't have access to those school meals and they lived too far away to be able to go pick up a curbside meal. And so we literally started mailing boxes of food, a week's worth of food, to children across rural communities around the US. And so, but yeah, it's thinking about these kinds of impacts that it has on families like Lupe's that are struggling on a daily basis everywhere in the US.
You said about being proximate to the problem, and we've had Brian Stevenson on too, and I think that philosophy, that principle is so critical, being proximate to the problem. And I think as Christians, it's interesting, Jesus didn't say, hey, make sure that the widows are taken care of by somebody else, make sure that the, people are fed by somebody else. Like, he told us to do that as a as a mandate. But unfortunately, and I think it's I guess it's considered a technological advancement. Sometimes we get so removed from the problem because we're able to just give a couple dollars to it and let somebody else take care of it. But I do think that seeing it up close matters, which brings me to my next question, actually. Jenny, I think a lot of people assume that the government is addressing hunger, globally, that it's the government's taking care of it. Can you really help us understand, like, when it comes to foreign aid, what's really happening there? And then, why is it that it's so underfunded?
Yeah, these are good questions. So yeah, and I'd love Jeremy to speak to kind of the U.S. domestic piece on issues around hunger too, because he's the expert there. But internationally, when we talk about foreign aid, Nona, they do polls every year with Kaiser Family Foundation, and when they ask a good random swath of Americans, how much do you think we give in foreign aid, they usually respond to the tune of about 28%. So over 50% of Americans think it's, almost between 25 and 30%. The reality is, and they suggest we tithe, we give 10%. The reality is, of all the foreign assistance we give, it's less than 1% of the US budget. It's less than 1%. So most Americans just don't know that up front. They think that we're spending a lot of money, maybe the optics of it, but the reality is we're not. We do give a lot of money for foreign assistance. We lead the world in it, but we don't give a lot in terms of the percentage of our budget, if that makes sense. we're not as generous as other nations in terms of the percentage. That being said, when you piece it down and you look at the pie graph of what we spend in global health, everything we give for AIDS and TB and malaria and vaccines, COVID and otherwise, now what we give for clean water, education around the world, nutrition gets about 1% of that 1%. So it's really a tiny sliver of the pie. Global nutrition has about $150 million we give annually. And for that, about 22 million lives are saved with that funding every year. It's an incredible amount, and it targets what I was talking about earlier about the chronic malnutrition. It targets children and mothers specifically to combat stunting and malnutrition. So there's definitely room to expand, particularly in a season of COVID. Particularly when there are nations like South Sudan and North Nigeria and Yemen who are on the brink of famines and starvations right now. Like, I believe we're called as Christians to lift up these people in these nations, even if I don't know them personally, or we do know them personally, and we talk about incarnational living. Either way, these are vulnerable populations that need our help. And I also believe that food is a human right. They should have access to this. So
this is so important. I think this idea that it's being taken care of by somebody else or something else is probably the biggest impediment to actual progress. Is, oh, somebody else is taking care of that. I would love for you to speak to that too, Jeremy, like in terms of domestically, what is happening when it comes to the government supporting hunger, and what does that look like? Because I think the next question, of course, is just, how do we as individuals affect change? It can feel so big and so overwhelming, but I think there are things that we can do. So I'd love for you to share just what's happening domestically. How is the government contributing to this crisis?
Yeah, well, what people don't realize is that the federal government in the U.S. Does the lion's share of addressing food insecurity in the U.S. Oftentimes we might see a Meals on Wheels or a food bank, and we think that these are charitably funded organizations. But most of the time, 80 to 90% of the food that are in those warehouses are funded through our tax dollars. It's federally funded programs. Programs like the school lunch program and the school breakfast program have a huge impact on childhood hunger. I think what the program that gets the worst rap, unfortunately, is our best intervention, which is the SNAP program, or what we used to call the food stamp program. For every dollar that comes into a community through that program, it has $1.80 worth of economic stimulative effect. And so most communities, like communities in Tennessee and in Florida and Texas and Mississippi, we don't do a very good job of making sure that people who are eligible for those programs are signed up for the programs. Now, some of this is because of stigma. Some of it's because our state agencies don't make this a priority, or our state governments don't make this a priority. Maybe it's because philosophically we don't believe that people should utilize that program. But I joke with our economists and call it trickle up economics, because you're investing in the people in the lowest income households in your community who immediately take that money and they reinvest it in the local grocery store. And so one of the National Grocers Association informed us that that program counts for about 1 in every 10 jobs they have in the local grocery stores. And so then the money even trickles up, to the owners of the company. So in Waco alone, we left $35 million on the table last year in unused SNAP benefits because we didn't sign up families who were eligible for the program. So in your states, you're leaving well over $1 billion a year on the table in unused benefits. And so not only does that have a direct impact on the local family who needs access to food and can go down to the grocery store and buy that food, it also has a huge impact on your community. So that would have been about $55 million worth of economic stimulus in our little Waco community had we just signed those families up for that program. We don't have any other federal program that comes in that's as large as what we left on the table through SNAP. So the federal government plays a very important role in addressing domestic hunger. but it doesn't play the only role. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot as an organization is our philosophy, which is no one organization or one sector can end hunger or poverty by themselves. It inherently requires us all working in concert with each other if we want to really lead to systemic, sustainable social change.
It strikes me that one of the actionable takeaways from this conversation, I think, for people viewing this is to find out in your local community, where is there the gap between the supply of food stamps and potentially the demand for food stamps? Because it sounds like if there are basically unused food stamps, then there's an opportunity for your church to be a conduit to partner with the government and help to amplify the fact that this program is available as a mechanism to connect people to resources. So to me, that's one of the takeaways and the ahas. Like I was already thinking in my mind, I was like, oh man, how can our church support this? So I hope others are thinking that way too. I'd love, Jenny, for you to share. Similarly, I think when we think about global hunger, it can feel so overwhelming. So I'd love for you to share what people can do, how they can support, and what role they can play in this.
Yeah, so I do want to echo Jeremy, because I may not have said it enough. Just the government does play a massive role, alongside multilateral, the UN World Food Program, in providing food around the world. We couldn't do the systemic, sustainable work we do in hunger to ending the deaths around hunger without governmental intervention. So this is why we're here talking with you today and talking with people in the church. We want them to know this. But to your point, it's important to partner with the government, and it's important for the church to empower the government to do this. So simple ways, right? So they can easily get involved through philanthropy and get involved with the kinds of work and organizations that Jeremy works with across the United States or around the world that deliver foods, service providers, nonprofit organizations. There's a lot of groups. And I actually didn't mention, but we did a book called The End of Hunger. Jeremy wrote one essay in it. And in the back of the book, we have a whole list of nonprofits we recommend that folks can get involved with for that philanthropy and volunteer work. The other thing that I would strongly flag is advocacy. And what that looks like is it takes like 2 minutes of people's time and it changes the world. And it's really just going to senate.gov or house.gov, looking up your representative, your senator, and letting them know simply that they care about those living with food insecurity, living with hunger in developing nations around the world. That's all they really have to say. If they want to say more, they can say they support funding for global nutrition, and let them know that. Let them know that they support that. Let them know that they empower their member of Congress to support these very important issues, because they're Christians, because they're moral issues, because this is what the Bible calls them to do. And what it then does is allow those congressional members to be leaders and champions on the Hill for shaping policy and legislation and better funding around nutrition and hunger. So simple as that. Doesn't take much time. It's free. Mm-hmm. And it really does change the world.
Yeah. Well, this conversation has been so rich and so compelling for me. I'd love, starting with you, Jeremy, I'd love for you to just provide just any closing thoughts you have, anything else you would love to share with people to help them take action on this issue. Obviously, education is important, awareness is important, but we get educated so that we can take action. So what would you like to share?
That's right. That's a great way to frame that. And here are a couple thoughts. One, for those of us who come from a Christian faith perspective, the only eschatological scene we see in the entire Gospel of Matthew, or the only end of the world scene, comes in Matthew 25, when Jesus comes back and he gathers all the people before him, and he begins to separate the sheep and the goats, the righteous from the accused. And to the astonishment of the people gathered, the criterion for judgment wasn't confession of faith in Christ, but it was whether or not you acted with love and cared for the needy. And so I think the one thing that we need to know is that this is a non-negotiable as people of faith to care for the hungry. In fact, Jesus refers to the hungry in that passage as members of his family. The rest of us are judged based upon what we did or didn't do to further their cause. So I think from a church standpoint, we need to do a better job of formation and in recognizing that we need our people, that when they are walking out of our churches on Sunday mornings or turning off Zoom on Sunday mornings, that they feel compelled to act and understand that it is an outgrowth of their faith perspective. So that's the first thing. I'd say the second thing is, if you're going to address hunger, why not end it? Jenny mentioned that this is a rights issue. We need to stop thinking about basic needs as basic needs and reframe our thinking to think about these issues as basic fundamental rights. This is a justice issue. If people don't have access to healthy food, when we actually grow an adequate amount for every person in the world to have access to 3 healthy meals a day, 7 days a week, and we have people that are literally starving and haven't had access to meals in sometimes over a week in some of these global locations, or we have children in our own communities who are missing meals for weekends at a time, or parents that don't know how they're going to put food on the table. Let's work together to end it. And so I think the way that we do that is we do that through creating hunger-free community coalitions. We get everybody together. You get your grandmother, you get your church, you get the nonprofit organizations, you get the local government and the corporate sector, all working together to identify where are gaps of services and what can we do as a community to address those gaps. And so there are great resources out there. Map the Meal Gap is a great resource that can tell you what kind of resources are available to your community. Just mapthemealgap.org. And then hungerandpoverty.org is our website, and you can learn how you can create a hunger-free community coalition in your town. But there's no reason that my children or my grandchildren, my future grandchildren, are going to need to be addressing this issue, because we have adequate resources to be able to comprehensively end it. And if we work together, we can do it. So that's how I want people to walk away from this conversation. Don't just volunteer in a food pantry. That's good. That's a good first step. But get into this issue to end it.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good, Jenny. I would love your thoughts as well and your call to action.
Sure. I mean, exact same as Jeremy. I echo him 100%. I will say that we lead at the 2030 Collaborative a faith-based coalition for global nutrition. So all the faith leaders who are watching this right now, I would completely invite you to be a part of this coalition. That we represent over 200 faith leaders across the nation. I think Jeremy's one of them. Nona, you're one of them. And many, many others. We regularly have, 300 faith leaders sign our letters to members of Congress, and we would welcome their participation. And I would love to get to know them better.
Wow. Well, this has been just an incredible conversation, so practical. I thank you very much for giving us a window into an issue that unfortunately many of us may not be aware of. We have been very blessed, very fortunate. And so many of us probably didn't understand the depth of this issue, but we have been called through the gospel, through the example of Jesus Christ, to meet the needs of those who cannot help themselves. And so I'm just grateful for both of your time. I'm grateful for both of your work. And on behalf of everyone watching, we will do the work. We will do the work. And if you agree with me, I want you to give me some hallelujah hands in the chat because I do believe that we have been called. So thank you both so much. God bless you. God bless your work. And for everyone watching, thank you for tuning in. Let's get to work.